John Anderson sat on the worn-out couch in his modest living room, staring blankly at the flickering TV screen. The evening news anchor droned on about rising crime rates in the city, but John wasn't really paying attention. His mind was elsewhere, drifting between the memories of a life that felt distant and the quiet, uneventful days he now spent in his suburban home. At 57, John had been retired from the police force for almost 5 years, but he still carried the weight of his past like a heavy coat he couldn't shrug off. John lived in a small, quiet town just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where neighbors exchanged polite greetings but rarely ventured beyond casual conversation. His house, a simple one-story building with a faded white picket fence, sat on the corner of a sleepy cul-de-sac. He had lived there alone since his divorce, finding solace in the solitude after decades of chasing criminals and dealing with the ugliness of the world. The routine of retirement was predictable, even comforting at times. Morning coffee, a walk around the block, then hours spent either in front of the TV or tinkering in his garage. John was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent under stress. His hair, now mostly gray, was cropped short in a style that hadn't changed since his days on the force. There was an intensity in his sharp blue eyes, even though they were often clouded with fatigue or distant thoughts. As he took a sip of his beer, the phone buzzed. It was an old habit, picking it up with the hope of hearing something more than telemarketers or spam. But tonight, like many nights before, there was nothing. Just silence in the house, broken by the soft hum of the TV, a life that had grown all too quiet. The neighborhood where John lived had always been peaceful, a suburban haven far removed from the chaos of the city. The lawns were neatly trimmed, mailboxes stood uniform at the edge of every driveway, and children rode their bikes without a care in the world. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and that suited John just fine. After decades in law enforcement, he had seen enough to last him several lifetimes. He had come to this sleepy neighborhood to escape the ghosts of his past, to live out his days in relative anonymity, away from the noise and violence that once consumed him. But lately, there had been subtle changes in the neighborhood. New faces moved in, some younger, some from different walks of life. A few houses down, a family from Chicago had bought a place, and while most people welcomed the diversity, others whispered behind closed doors. John noticed the way some of his neighbors had grown quieter, more reserved, when discussing certain topics, like they were tiptoeing around something they didn't quite understand. This new shift made him uneasy, not because of who was moving in, but because it reminded him of the tensions he had dealt with during his career. In his time as a police officer, John had seen his fair share of racial tensions boil over. St. Louis wasn't immune to the fractures that plagued the rest of the country, and John had been on the front lines of more than one incident that had threatened to rip the community apart. Those memories were still fresh: protests, heated encounters with colleagues, and the nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't always done the right thing. There were times, especially during the height of the Ferguson unrest, when John had been forced to confront his own biases and question his role in a system that wasn't always just. Now, in the quiet of his suburban refuge, those old doubts crept back in. Watching the neighborhood change stirred something in him, though he tried to brush it off as just the discomfort of an aging man seeing the world evolve around him. He had wanted a clean break from the past, but in many ways, it seemed like the past had followed him here, lurking in the background, waiting for its moment to re-emerge. It was a late afternoon when John first noticed the twins. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the street, and the air had that early autumn chill that hinted at the coming cold. He had just returned from his usual walk and was sitting on the porch, a habit he had developed to watch the world pass by at the slow pace of his neighborhood. At first, the two boys seemed like any other kids, around 13 or 14, maybe a little younger, dressed in loose jeans and oversized hoodies. But there was something off about the way they moved. John squinted, his trained instincts kicking in, and noticed the nervous energy in their steps. They weren't just walking. They were looking around, scanning the street like they were afraid of being followed. They were identical twins, dark-skinned with close-cropped hair, their faces mirrors of each other, but both etched with worry. As they neared John's house, their pace slowed, and one of them nudged the other, as if silently encouraging him to keep going. They kept glancing behind them, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. John leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. He had never seen these boys around before. They definitely weren't from the neighborhood, and in a place like this, that was unusual. People rarely passed through unless they lived nearby. The twins stopped a few yards from his porch, exchanging whispers too quiet for John to hear. Finally, one of them pointed to John's house, and they cautiously approached. "Hey," John called out, his voice calm but authoritative, the way he used to speak when dealing with nervous witnesses. "You boys lost?" The twins froze, wide-eyed, before the bolder one spoke up. "No, sir. We just—" He glanced at his brother, who looked down at the ground. "We need help." John raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the first time someone had come to him for help. His reputation as a retired cop sometimes preceded him, but it was rare. What kind of help? There was a pause, and in that brief moment, John could see the fear in their eyes more clearly. This wasn't just a case of lost kids. Something was seriously wrong. They looked too afraid for it to be anything minor. "We don't know where else to go," the other twin said, his voice quieter. "Someone's after us." John stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as the weight of the boy's words sank in. His years on the force had taught him to read people, and these kids weren't lying. They were scared, genuinely scared. He stepped down from the porch and motioned them over, his voice steady. "Come on up. Tell me what's going on," John said, keeping his tone firm but not too harsh. He knew he had to strike a balance between gaining their trust and showing that he was in control of the situation. The boys hesitated for a moment, exchanging another glance, before they cautiously stepped onto the porch. They stood close together, as if drawing strength from each other, their eyes darting around, as if someone might appear from the shadows at any second. John opened the door to his house, and after a moment's hesitation, the twins followed him inside. The living room felt smaller with the three of them in it, the air thick with tension. John gestured for them to sit down on the old couch, and they perched on the edge, still fidgeting. He grabbed a chair from the kitchen and sat down across from them, giving them space but keeping his presence steady. "Start from the beginning," John said, leaning forward slightly. "What's going on? Who's after you?" The bolder of the two boys, the one who had spoken first, swallowed hard before answering. "It's a man. He's been following us for days. We thought we lost him, but he knows where we are. We don't know why. He just won't leave us alone." John's stomach tightened. This wasn't some neighborhood spat or a harmless misunderstanding. He could see the raw fear in their eyes. They weren't making this up, and it wasn't just kid stuff. "Do you know who he is? Have you seen him before?" John asked, keeping his voice calm but pressing for details. The boys had given him just enough to know this could be serious, but he needed more. The quieter twin finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "He's from our neighborhood. We saw him around before, but he never looked at us. Not until a few days ago. Now he keeps showing up, and he's always watching." John frowned, his mind already working through possibilities. "Did you tell anyone? Your parents, maybe?" Both boys shook their heads quickly. "We can't," the first one said. "Our moms? She's working 2 jobs, and she wouldn't believe us. She's already stressed out. She doesn't need to worry about this." John leaned back slightly, trying to process what he was hearing. He'd seen this before. Kids from struggling families, trying to protect their parents by handling things themselves. It never ended well. And now, here they were, in his living room, terrified and looking for a solution. "You did the right thing coming here," John said after a pause. "But I need to know everything. If someone's after you, I need to know exactly who and why." The boys exchanged another look, their hesitation palpable. John could tell they were holding something back, something they were afraid to admit. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into that old, reassuring tone he used to use with scared witnesses. "Whatever it is, you're safe here. But I can't help if I don't know the whole story." For a moment, there was silence. Then, finally, the bolder twin looked at John with a mix of fear and desperation in his eyes. "There's more. Something happened, and it's bad. Really bad." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as the words hung between them. John leaned forward, elbows on his knees, waiting for the boys to continue. He could feel it in his gut. Whatever they were about to say was going to change everything. The Boulder twin spoke first, his voice trembling but determined. A few nights ago, we saw him, the man. He was with someone else, and they were arguing, real bad. We were just walking back home, but we heard them yelling, so we hid. John's gaze sharpened. He had seen plenty of situations escalate from arguments to something far worse during his years on the force. What happened? He asked quietly, already fearing the answer. The quieter twin picked up the story, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud might make it worse. We saw him hurt the other guy. He hit him, real hard. And then, he didn't get up. John sat still, his heart pounding now. You mean, you saw him kill someone? His voice remained calm, but inside, alarms were ringing. If what the boys were saying was true, they were in serious danger. Witnesses to a murder, pursued by a man who knew they had seen too much. The twins nodded, their eyes wide with fear. We didn't know what to do, the Boulder one continued. We ran, but he saw us. We've been hiding ever since, but he found out where we live. We think he's going to come for us. John rubbed his face, trying to think through the situation. This wasn't just about some petty neighborhood issue. These boys had stumbled into something far more dangerous, and now they were being hunted by a killer. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could the boys be exaggerating? But the terror in their eyes was real. They believed every word of what they were saying. Do you know who the guy is? His name? Anything about him? John asked, his voice steady, trying to gather any useful details. The Boulder twin nodded. His name's Roy Matthews. He's from our neighborhood, but no one really talks to him. He's always been weird. But we never thought he'd do something like this. John recognized the name. Roy Matthews. He had heard it before, back when he was still on the force. A guy with a history of small-time crimes. Nothing major, but the kind of person you didn't want around your kids. John's instincts kicked in. If Roy was involved in something like this, the boys were in more danger than they realized. John stood up, pacing for a moment, trying to formulate a plan. He couldn't just leave them to fend for themselves, not now. You can't go back home, he said firmly. If this guy's dangerous, we need to handle this carefully. I'll figure something out, but you're staying here for now. The twins looked at him, relief mixed with anxiety on their faces. They had come to John because they didn't know where else to go, and now he was the only thing standing between them and a killer. John's mind was already racing with possibilities. He'd have to contact someone, former colleagues, maybe even the local police. But first, he needed to make sure these boys were safe. As he looked at the twins, still sitting on the edge of his couch, it struck him just how much had changed in the last hour. His quiet retirement was over, and once again, he was being pulled back into the world of danger and responsibility. But this time, it wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about protecting two scared kids who had no one else to turn to. As the twins sat nervously on the couch, John retreated into his thoughts, pacing back and forth across the small living room. He hadn't planned on this, being pulled back into a life of danger, especially after years of trying to leave it all behind. He'd fought hard for the quiet retirement he now had, the calm and predictability of his days. But these boys, with their fear-filled eyes and their desperate story, had brought all of that crashing down. Part of him wanted to send them away, to call the police and let someone else handle it. He was retired, after all. He had done his time, paid his dues, and now all he wanted was peace. He had seen enough violence and heartache for one lifetime. In his mind, John could hear the voice of his ex-wife, echoing from their final arguments before the divorce. You don't know when to stop, John. You never could walk away from the job, even when it wasn't your fight anymore. But now, it felt like this was his fight. As much as he didn't want it to be, the look on the boys' faces pulled at something deep inside him. They were too young to face something like this on their own. He had seen too many kids lost to the system, too many young lives derailed by trauma, violence, and fear. These twins reminded him of some of the kids he had tried to protect back in his days on the force. Only now, he wasn't just an officer. He was the only one standing between them and a killer. Still, the conflict inside him raged. John's hands ran through his graying hair as he stopped in front of the window, staring out at the darkening street. He knew what getting involved would mean. It would pull him back into the very world he had spent years trying to escape. The world where every decision was a life or death call, where the line between right and wrong was often blurred, and where every mistake haunted you. He turned back to the boys, who were watching him in silence. The older twin, or at least the one who spoke more, was doing his best to put on a brave face, but John could see through it. They were scared out of their minds, and with good reason. John cleared his throat. "Look," he started, unsure of how to say what he needed to. "You guys shouldn't have to deal with this on your own, but I need to think. There's a lot at stake here. If this man really did what you're saying, it's serious. And if he's after you, you can't go back home." The twins nodded, clearly relieved that he wasn't turning them away. But John still wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. "Let me make a few calls," John said, grabbing his old cell phone from the counter. He paused, staring at the screen, his thumb hovering over the contact list. Who was he going to call? His old partners? They would want to know everything, but the idea of getting sucked into an official investigation didn't sit right with him. Not yet. Not without knowing exactly what he was getting into. "I'll figure something out," he muttered to himself, more than to the boys. But as he looked at their hopeful faces, John couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility settling back on his shoulders, the same weight he thought he had left behind the day he turned in his badge. The truth was, John didn't know if he could walk away from this. Not now. He'd never been the type to sit on the sidelines, and these kids needed him. His instincts were screaming to take action, but for the first time in years, John wondered if he was still up for the fight. John couldn't sit still. After pacing the living room for what felt like hours, he finally made a decision. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and motioned to the boys. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me and don't let anyone in. I won't be long." The twins nodded obediently, their fear still evident but slightly softened by John's presence. As they locked the door behind him, John headed out into the cool evening air. His mind raced with thoughts about the situation at hand. Roy Matthews. He knew the name, and that bothered him. Matthews was small-time trouble when John was still on the force. Petty thefts, drunken fights, nothing major. But if the boys were telling the truth, things had escalated fast. John decided to head down to the local bar, a dive he used to frequent when he was still working. It wasn't the kind of place the neighbors would go, but it was the perfect spot to pick up rumors and hear things that wouldn't make it into the papers. He needed information, and fast. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit him, bringing back memories of late nights after tough shifts. The bar was mostly empty, save for a few regulars and the bartender, Joe, who gave John a nod of recognition. "John Anderson, back from the dead," Joe said with a smirk. "What brings you here? Thought you were done with all this." John forced a half smile and sat down at the bar. "Need some info, Joe. You still hear things?" Joe chuckled. "I hear everything, old man. What are you looking for?" John glanced around the bar, ensuring no one was paying them any attention. "Roy Matthews. You know him?" Joe's face changed instantly, the smile fading. "Yeah, I know him. And if you're asking about him, I'm guessing you heard something too." John's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I heard he's been hanging around some kids, making trouble, but I need to know more." Joe leaned in, lowering his voice. "Word is, Matthews got himself mixed up in something bad. Couple of weeks ago, he was seen hanging around with some out-of-town types. Rough guys, if you know what I mean. Things started getting tense, and now there's talk someone got hurt. Real bad." John's heart sank. The boys had been telling the truth. "Do you know where he is now?" Joe shook his head. "Haven't seen him in days. But if I had to guess, he's laying low somewhere. People are saying he's scared, like someone's after him now too. Word travels fast around here." John took a deep breath, trying to process what Joe had just told him. If Matthews had crossed someone dangerous and the boys had witnessed it, that put everyone involved in serious danger. And if Matthews was running scared, it meant things could spiral out of control fast. He stood up, throwing a few bills on the counter. "Thanks, Joe. If you hear anything else, let me know. Joe gave a curt nod. Watch yourself, John. This one smells bad. As John stepped back into the night, his thoughts raced. The twins were in deeper trouble than they knew. Whatever Matthews had gotten himself into wasn't just a neighborhood problem. It was the kind of mess that could end in bodies. He had to find a way to keep the boys safe and stop Matthews before things got worse. On his walk home, John's mind buzzed with the weight of the situation. He thought about calling one of his old friends from the force, but something held him back. This wasn't an ordinary case, and if the wrong people got involved, the boys could end up in the system. Or worse, caught in the crossfire of whatever was going on. Back at the house, he knocked softly, and the twins let him back inside. Their eyes were full of questions, but John didn't give them answers just yet. "I've got some leads," he said, his voice steady. "But things are worse than you think. We need to stay one step ahead of this. And I need you two to trust me, no matter what happens. Understand?" The twins nodded, their faces pale but resolute. John looked at them and felt the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He wasn't just protecting witnesses. He was protecting kids who had no one else. And that made the stakes impossibly high. As the night deepened, John sat quietly at the kitchen table, his mind racing. The twins had gone to sleep, or at least they were pretending to. They were too scared to truly rest, their small bodies curled up on the worn couch under a single blanket. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling were the only sounds cutting through the silence, giving John too much space to think. He had gathered enough information to know the situation was serious. Roy Matthews was mixed up in something bigger than the boys could comprehend. It wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a ticking time bomb involving dangerous people who wouldn't think twice about silencing witnesses, especially if those witnesses were a couple of scared kids. John felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. For years, he had worked to push aside the chaos of his old life, convincing himself that he was done with playing the hero, done with trying to fix the world. But now, here it was, right in his living room, staring back at him in the form of two terrified children. He couldn't just walk away. His hands clenched the edge of the table as memories of his time on the force flooded back. He had always been the guy who couldn't let things slide, who couldn't ignore someone in need, even when it cost him personally. It was why his marriage had failed. He had always put the job first, leaving his wife to deal with the aftermath. She had accused him of being addicted to the adrenaline, to the sense of control and purpose that came with wearing the badge. Maybe she had been right, but this situation wasn't about that. This was about doing what was right. And the truth was, if he didn't help these boys, no one would. John rose from the table and walked over to the couch, where the boys lay huddled together. He gently shook the shoulder of the older twin, the one who always spoke first. The boy blinked up at him, eyes wide with fear, but also with trust. John had earned that much from them. "I need you both to wake up," John said quietly but firmly. The younger twin stirred, sitting up groggily. "We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to help you, but we need to be smart about this." The boys sat up fully now, listening intently, their faces tense with anticipation. "I'm not going to lie to you," John continued. "This situation is bad. The man following you, Roy, he's mixed up in something dangerous. And if he knows you're witnesses, he's not going to stop. He'll come for you. But I'm not going to let that happen." The older twin swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "What are we supposed to do?" "We don't have anywhere to go." John nodded, understanding their fear. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere he won't find you. But before that, I need to take care of a few things. I'll need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." The boys exchanged a glance, then nodded in unison. "Okay," the older one said. "We trust you." John felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had their trust, but that only increased the pressure. He walked over to his closet, where he kept a few things from his past life, things he thought he'd never need again. Opening the door, he reached for his old service weapon, a Glock 19, and checked the magazine. It felt heavy in his hand, like a piece of his former self he thought he had left behind. He wasn't planning on using it, but he knew enough to be prepared. The world had a way of throwing the unexpected at you when you were least ready for it. He shoved the gun into the waistband of his jeans and grabbed his jacket. "We're leaving now," John said. "We'll stay low, and I'll handle Roy. You just need to follow me and stay quiet, all right?" The twins nodded, their fear now tempered by the determination they saw in John's eyes. As they stepped out into the cold night, John led them to his car, parked at the side of the house. The streets were quiet, too quiet. It made John uneasy. As he ushered the boys into the back seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street for any sign of movement. Nothing. Still, his instincts screamed at him to hurry. John got into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The quiet neighborhood, the one that had once seemed like a peaceful refuge, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more threatening. "I'm going to get you out of this," John muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the boys. He had made his decision. He was all in now, and there was no turning back. The drive was tense, the silence in the car thick with fear and anticipation. John kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was already racing through the possibilities of what was to come. He had a destination in mind, an old friend's cabin, tucked away in the woods about 30 miles out of town. It was a place he could trust, far from anyone who might be looking for the boys. But as the minutes ticked by, his gut told him this wasn't going to be a simple run to safety. Halfway out of town, John's rearview mirror caught something: headlights. At first, he dismissed them as another late-night driver. But the car stayed too close, never passing, never turning away. His instincts flared. He knew the feeling all too well from his years as a cop. They were being followed. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Stay calm," he said, glancing back at the boys, who were already watching him with wide, fearful eyes. "We've got company." The older twin swallowed hard. "Is it him?" John nodded slightly. "It might be, but don't worry. I've got this." His voice was calm, but his mind was spinning through every scenario, trying to figure out the best course of action. He couldn't lead the boys straight to the cabin if Roy was on their tail. He needed to shake him, or this would end badly. He took a sharp turn off the main road, onto a smaller, winding back road that cut through the woods. The headlights behind him followed. John cursed under his breath, knowing that whoever was behind them was determined. He had a plan, a risky one, but it might be their only chance. Another turn, deeper into the woods, and John hit the gas, speeding up until the car bounced slightly on the uneven road. The twins clutched their seat belts, their fear palpable in the confined space. The car behind them accelerated too, closing the gap. "Hold on," John muttered, his eyes darting to a small clearing up ahead. He made a split-second decision and yanked the wheel, pulling off the road and killing the lights. The car slid to a stop, hidden among the trees, the engine ticking in the sudden silence. John gestured for the boys to stay quiet, his hand gripping the Glock he had pulled from his waistband. His heart pounded, but his focus was razor-sharp. He watched as the car following them roared past, its driver not realizing John had veered off the road. The twins held their breath, looking at John for reassurance. "He didn't see us," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "We've got a few minutes before he doubles back. We need to move. Now." John got out of the car, scanning the dark woods for any signs of danger. "Come on," he urged the boys as they scrambled out of the back seat. "We'll cut through the woods on foot. It's about a mile to the cabin. Stick close to me and stay quiet." The trek through the woods was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig seemed too loud. Every shadow seemed like it could be hiding Roy, or worse, someone more dangerous. But John kept moving, his senses heightened by the threat looming behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the cabin, a small, weathered structure that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. John fumbled for the key his friend had given him long ago and unlocked the door, ushering the boys inside. The cabin was dark and musty, but safe. John quickly secured the door and turned to the boys, their faces pale and wide-eyed. "We're safe for now," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. He could feel the weight of what was still to come. Before John could relax, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. His blood ran cold. Roy had found them. The pounding on the door came next, violent and desperate. "I know you're in there." Roy's voice was harsh, filled with a mix of anger and fear. "Send the boys out, John. This doesn't concern you." John's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at the twins, who were trembling, their backs pressed against the far wall. "Stay back," John whispered, pulling the Glock from his waistband. His hand was steady, though his mind was a storm of thoughts. He stepped toward the door, his voice calm but firm. "Roy, you don't want to do this. You're in deep enough already. Let it go before it gets worse." There was a pause, then more banging. "It's too late for that. Those kids saw something they shouldn't have. I've got no choice." John's jaw tightened. "There's always a choice. Walk away, Roy. You don't want to add more to your plate. You're in enough trouble as it is." For a moment, the banging stopped. John listened intently, his finger brushing the trigger, prepared for anything. Then, slowly, the sound of retreating footsteps. Roy was backing off, at least for now, but John knew this wasn't over. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The boys were still frozen in place, staring at him with a mixture of fear and awe. "It's okay," John said softly, lowering the gun. "He's gone for now. But this isn't over yet." John knew they had to call the police to deal with this the right way. He had managed to buy them some time, but Roy was still out there, and the danger hadn't passed. But at that moment, the boys were safe, and that was enough, for now. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the small windows of the cabin. John sat at the kitchen table, his face drawn with exhaustion. The past hours had been a blur. After the confrontation with Roy, he had called in some favors. One of his old colleagues from the force had agreed to quietly send a team to pick up the twins, ensuring their protection while keeping the situation off the radar for now. Roy would be found soon enough, but the boys' safety had been the immediate priority. The twins sat across from him, huddled together with cups of warm tea that John had made in the cabin's ancient kettle. They were still shaken, but the terror in their eyes had softened into a tired relief. They were safe, at least for the moment. John watched them closely, feeling a strange mix of emotions that he hadn't expected. In the quiet of the early morning, John's mind drifted back to the life he had thought he'd left behind. For so long, he had run from the person he used to be, the cop who couldn't let go, who was always willing to dive into danger because it was the only way he knew how to live. He had thought that retirement would give him peace, but the truth was, he had just been hiding. The sense of purpose he had once found in his work had left a void in his life. One he hadn't realized was still there until now. The boys, sensing his gaze, looked up at him. The older one, the one who had spoken the most during their ordeal, gave John a small, grateful nod. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of what John had done for them. For the first time in years, John felt something shift inside him. A quiet recognition that this wasn't just about solving a case or stopping a criminal. This was about helping people, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was what he had always been good at, and maybe, just maybe, it was what he was meant to keep doing. "You're gonna be all right," John said softly, his voice steady but filled with a depth of emotion he hadn't shown before. "The police are on their way. They'll take care of you now." The boys exchanged a glance, and the younger twin finally spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for everything. We didn't know where else to go." John nodded, the weight of their gratitude settling over him like a warm, heavy blanket. "You did the right thing. You're safe now, and that's what matters." As the distant sound of sirens began to grow closer, John stood up and moved to the door, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. He felt the cool breeze on his face, a stark contrast to the chaos and tension that had filled the last 24 hours. The police would be there soon, and the boys would be taken somewhere safe. Roy would be found, and justice would take its course. But for John, something far more profound had happened. This wasn't just about stepping in to solve a problem. This was about rediscovering a part of himself that he had thought was gone. He had spent years hiding behind the routine of retirement, convincing himself that his time had passed, that he no longer had a role to play in the world. But now he realized that the instincts, the drive to protect, to seek justice, were still there. They had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to surface. As the police cars pulled up, John felt a quiet sense of resolution wash over him. He had stepped back into the world he thought he had left behind, but this time, it was on his terms. He wasn't running from it anymore. Instead, he was embracing it, accepting that his role in life, whether as a cop or just as a man who cared about doing the right thing, wasn't something he could ever truly retire from. The twins were ushered into one of the police cars, and before they drove off, the older one looked back at John through the window. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, John knew that this had been more than just another job for him. It had been a turning point. As the cars disappeared down the road, John stood in the morning light, the world around him feeling both familiar and new. The quiet suburban life he had once cherished no longer felt like a refuge. Instead, it felt like a place where he could start again, not by forgetting his past, but by accepting it. For the first time in a long time, John Anderson felt at peace, not because the danger had passed, but because he had finally stopped running from who he really was. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving,